Okay.
Okay, I guess I'll start.
Go ahead.
Hello?
Go ahead.
Okay, so many of you know Luise Hermanutz, and some of you who've been on for the last few minutes have certainly had a chance to chat with her. You may recall that about a year and a half ago, she gave us a most interesting talk on the Newfoundland limestone barrens and the rare brayas. Perhaps a few less know Luise's husband, David Innes, but both Luise and David used to teach biology at Memorial University. And correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but Luise taught plant ecology and conservation biology, basically, and her main research interests the impacts of climate change on Arctic and alpine ecosystems, particularly in Labrador and the Arctic, and the impacts of non-native invasive species on forest regeneration and the conservation of the fragile Newfoundland limestone barrens ecosystem. David taught genetics and evolution, basically, and his main interests were the genetics of water fleas and blue mussels, as well as the mating systems of and population genetics of plants. Now, both Luise and David have now retired in a little house in the woods in Denman Island, about 70 kilometers northwest of Nanaimo, BC. However, as far as I know, both have remained honorary research professors at MUN and are showing that retirement is often just a state of mind. They're sort of still at it. In Newfoundland in particular, Luise has remained active and committed to her ongoing work on the limestone barrens. So, as some of you may have figured out,
something.
what?
Okay, bye.
Okay, recently, Luise and David traveled to the Arizona desert to visit a friend, apparently, and to observe what Luise referred to as the spring super bloom, which she'll tell you all about, I guess, but also cranes. Anyway, so this evening we're fortunate to have the two of them with us to share these very interesting sounding Southern experiences, and take it away, guys.
Thank you, John. And yes, we are still honorary research professors,
Yeah.
so you still have to put up with us for a while.
Oh, goodness.
Okay. Put it on. There we go.
Trying to.
Oh, you're trying to. Okay. This could be interesting.
Okay.
I don't think we've ever given a talk together.
No.
No, okay. So we will try not to fight. Okay, so I'll start it out by saying we did go down to visit a friend of ours, and that friend is Joyce Mashinsky. Many of you actually, I should have put a picture up.
Yeah.
I meant to do that. Wilf knows her well. Some of you may remember way back, she actually came to Newfoundland to be the PhD examiner of Dr. Susan Squires. And she gave a talk up at the Botanical Garden. I think she gave a talk in the biology department. So some of you would have met her. Anyway, she was at Fairchild Botanical Garden and then moved to San Diego Zoo to become the head of plant conservation. And so she just retired last June and moved from San Diego, where we used to visit her, to Arizona, to Tucson, Arizona. And hence, we had to go down and bug her. So what I'd like to do is just give a quick overview of some of the things we saw. The caveat is, as some of you heard, it was quite cool there. So many of the plants that we expected to be blooming weren't. And so we were kind of on the forefront of the bloom, but I've been tracking it. And apparently it's pretty amazing right now. So we were a bit early, but we still did see some amazing things. Anything else to add?
No, that's good. Next
Okay.
slide.
Next slide, please. Okay, so just to get everybody,
Where Arizona is.
I'm sure most of you have been there. Just to give you the geography, because I'm a very visual person. So we went to several places kind of in the south part by Tucson. You'll see Sweetwater Preserve, which we'll talk about quickly, and then Whitewater Draw Wildlife Area, which is where the cranes are. and then we went a little bit north of there into the Chiricahua Mountains. And then on another foray, we went out to Barago Springs. And if you look just kind of to the east of San Diego, you'll see that that's where Anzo Barago Desert State Park is, which is, if you haven't been there and you've got a trip left in you, you should definitely go because it's an amazing place. Then in another trip, we headed north to Sedona and Flagstaff, and Sedona is just south of Flagstaff. And then, of course, we went to the Grand Canyon. So I'm probably one of the few people who haven't been to Grand Canyon. So this was my first trip to Grand Canyon. Dave had been there many, many years ago, but it was pretty exciting because it was Grand Canyon in the snow. Okay, next. So one of the things that really struck me that I hadn't really, let's just say, had a good appreciation of is just how, let's see, it kind of reminds me of Newfoundland in a way, because it's a real mixture, Arizona, of different vegetation types. So if you see, Tucson is circled there. And if you look, you can see, yeah, maybe, can you see the cursor? Can you see the cursor?
Yes,
No.
we can. I can
Where?
see the cursor.
Yeah, I can see the cursor.
Oh, yes,
It's
yes.
right, it's, okay.
Oh, there.
So the neat thing about Arizona is it has 4 deserts. Of course, the biggest one here is the Sonoran Desert, right? It goes right down to the Baja and into California, down into Mexico. So that's a huge desert. But it also has a wee little finger of the Chihuahuan Desert, which of course goes down into Mexico. It also has a little bit of the Mojave up in this area here. That's the brown, but it also has right at the very top, if you go north of Flagstaff here, the Great Basin Desert also comes down. So it has 4 deserts, which are quite different from one another, but it also has all these other really interesting vegetation types, and of course all different plants. So in this brown area here are grasslands. So we'll show you some pictures of grasslands because we took a trip that went up into this area here, and then also has oak woodland and pine forest up in this area. So it's a real mixture. We all think of deserts and sand dunes and all that kind of stuff, but it's a real interesting kind of transition zone between all different types of deserts and all different types of other vegetation types. And I don't think I'd really appreciated that much. And I've also put in, or Dave has also put in some links that if you'd like to read more about it, one of the really neat places is Desert Museum just outside of Tucson. If you're ever in Tucson, it is an amazing place and it has so much on its website. Okay, and if anybody has any questions, I guess you can ask them later, I guess, or whatever. Okay, the other things that really, I guess, strikes you when you go to Arizona is the, I guess it's also a transition zone and also a meeting place for many, many First Nations, or Indians as they call them there. And so the big ones, of course, are the Apaches. So Apache corresponds to the huge area at the top here, also the Hopi. Okay, so you have Apache down here, and then you have a number of other very large Indian reserves, as they call them, scattered throughout. And so that's something that is constantly there in the background in terms of how that shaped Arizona as it is today. One of the really neat places we went to, which is north of Flagstaff, is this Wupakti Pueblo. It's amazing reconstruction of a very old pueblo that is claimed by the Hopi, the Zuni, and the Navajo. So, you know, if you're ever there, there's
Very good visitors.
lots of really interesting cultural background there that's well worth pursuing. Yeah, they have really good, at this place especially, they have a really excellent interpretation center, and it tells the story of this place, which has been, people came here about 100 years after this big volcano erupted called the Sunset volcano. And so it was, again, a meeting place. And the stories are told from all of these different First Nations as well as settlers. So it's pretty interesting. Okay, let's go our first place, and that's the Sweetwater Preserve. The other thing about Arizona, especially around Tucson, is all the protected areas. So here you see Saguaro National Park. The Sweetwater Preserve is adjacent to that. There's a big park here. Up to the north and the east is a huge Catalina State Park and Sabino Canyon, which is also an amazing place to visit. But we're going to go to this Sweetwater Preserve. It's the first day we were there. It was actually nice and warm and sunny. And this is, you know, a homage to the saguaro cactus, which are absolutely amazing. I could have stayed. We just took picture, Dave took picture after picture after picture, because every saguaro is different. It has its own, it starts out as a column. As you can see, some young ones in the background, they don't have any limbs yet. But when they put out their limbs, they're all different. Like you could have named every one and seen how different they are. We really fell in love with this cute one here. It looked like it was hugging itself. And then you have this other one that obviously lost its center column and then is putting all these other arms out. And the other thing that was really cool is just how when they grow, you know, the rows of spines have to get bigger. And so all of a sudden they'll just bifurcate and then a new ridge will form. So unfortunately, saguaros don't flower until much later. They're back pollinated, white flowers, and they don't, yeah. So unfortunately, we've got no flowers to show you. As you can see, many of these woody shrubs were still had not leafed out yet. But I want you to notice how sandy it looks there. And also, you're right, people are living right next to the preserve here. All right, so we did see a few really cool things. So the one on the left is called the fairy duster. We really love this one. It's a small woody shrub. And what's really cool is that you see it has, the petals are much reduced. So what you're looking at is actually the filaments of the anthers here. And that's what makes that beautiful, beautiful pink color. And it is the genus name of this. It actually means beautiful anthers, right? So it's a really beautiful small shrub, and it has pollen in little packets and that are moved by butterflies. So butterflies are attached to this. It has these little packets of pollen that it takes from plant to plant. We also saw the beginnings of the wild hyacinth. And that's really neat because, as you can see in the background, it's really sandy and pebbly, and that's where the bulbs really thrive. So this comes from a bulb, just like our hyacinths. And I think I read there were like 170 species of bulbs in the California and Arizona. So they really thrive in this kind of, you know, warm summer and dry summer. And then there was a little desert star, and those desert stars are really cute. They call them belly flowers. Kind of reminds me of the limestone barrens because Dave had to get right down on his knees to actually get a picture of this. And just like many desert flowers, how many flowers each plant has is totally dependent on how much rain they got. So you may have one tiny little flower when in a dry year. In a wet year, you'll have a profusion of them. And then you can actually see right next to that was a little bladder pod, and that is very similar to the bladder pods we have on the island, forms the same little round pod, but you can see that it's a crucifer with its 4 beautiful yellow flowers. And then ocotillo, if you've seen ocotillo before, it's kind of interesting because you can see this one has a lot of leaves up and down the stem. And that's, again, totally dependent on rain. If it's had a lot of rain, and this area had very good rains just before we came, it will sprout all these leaves, and it will take advantage of all of that soil moisture and photosynthesize like mad. And then as soon as it gets dry again, it will lose those. And I read that it can go through this getting leaves and losing them 6 times in 1 year. So it's totally dependent on how much rain is there. So we were lucky. We saw the stems with the leaves actually out. But again, its flowers don't, it's flowering right now, has these beautiful red hummingbird flowers at the very tip of the stems. Okay, so the next one here we went is, here's Tucson up in the left upper corner. So we went down to this whitewater draw. I'm going to hand it over to Dave now. And Bisbee is circled because we spent the nice night there, and it has its own story.
Okay, we were attracted to the Whitewater Draw wildlife area because of the concentration of migratory birds, and the most prominent one is the sandhill crane, which are these gray-looking birds, as well as snow geese. And so it was, you know, quite useful or interesting to get very close and get very good pictures. The sandhill cranes winter mostly in southern New Mexico, but there's a small number of areas, particularly this area, where the sandhill cranes winter in Arizona. And then looking at the information about their migratory habits, they actually breed over much of Canada, believe it or not. So they're probably
Remember
pretty
the
good.
species name?
Canadensis.
Yeah, the species name is Canadensis.
Yeah. And then the snow geese, which are also there with the sandhill cranes, they winter also in the southern part of the U.S., much more, I guess, fragmented and isolated compared to the sandhill cranes. And of course, it includes this area of Arizona. But they nest, as many of you probably know, in high Arctic, Hudson's Bay area and up into the Canadian Arctic. And interspersed with some of these regular snow geese are the what they call the blue morph, different darker colored morph. But it was hard not to take tons and tons and tons of pictures and videos. It's quite stimulating visually as well as the sounds they make, and it's very fun to watch them land as they drop their landing gear, their long legs. And of course, there are lots of other birds there. The most striking in terms of color was this male vermilion flycatcher, which took a bit of effort to chase around and try and get a reasonably good picture. And then, you know, a killdeer, nothing special there, but northern pintail, northern shovelers. Again, it was very hard to get a good picture of the northern shoveler because most of the time they spent it with their heads underwater. So I have lots and lots of pictures of a group of them foraging, but hardly ever bringing up. I guess they came up every once in a while to breathe, but they were basically scrounging around for food and this American coot. So I'll pass it back to Luise to talk about Bisbee, where we stayed. We drove into Bisbee to arrive at the B&B that we had booked, but it's a very interesting place in terms of mining history.
Right. So if you look on the map that Dave put in on the right, we came in from the highway from the right, and you go right through where these huge pits were dug, and that's what you're seeing on the left upper photo. And so this is the extent of the pit, and you can see all the open mined terraces being formed to the south there, and over to the right are settling ponds. So you come in here and you see these incredible scars left by the open pit mining. And so this was called the Copper Queen mine. It was something like over 23% copper, which is huge. And they mined 7.7 billion pounds of copper, along with millions and millions of pounds of silver and gold and a whole bunch of other minerals. So Bisbee basically was depopulated when the mine closed in the mid-80s. And so what happened is, it was at its heyday in the late 1800s and into the 1900s. It was the biggest town between the coast and, what did I say, St. Louis. So that whole, it was a really huge, and of course it's built into a valley. And here you can see a couple of shots. They've kept the kind of Old West buildings downtown, which you see here. And then in the background, you can see the mountain there where they've tried to rehabilitate it. And it's kind of interesting because after all the miners left, then they say a bunch of hippies and artists came in. That's what they said on the description. And so now it's a very bohemian kind of place. There's all kinds of interesting art and small businesses there. You can see some of the old hotels, and we stayed up this road, so you have to take you have to wheel your little wheelies up the road, but you can see it's like in a valley, right? And it's a really interesting place. And I just thought, some of us remember these boots and probably wore them, but there was actually a 70s and 80s store. So apparently we need to dig out our platform shoes again. Okay, the next place we're going to go is, once we left Bisbee, over here on the left, we went, and this is the really interesting place. If you think back to the vegetation map I showed you, you can see we're right in the corner here with New Mexico. And of course, Mexico is right to the south of us. And this area here is this huge transition between the desert and then across the grasslands into that finger of the Chihuahuan Desert I talked about, and then up into the Chiricahua Mountains and the woodland. Okay, we're gonna end up at Southwest Research Station, and that's a really interesting station run by the American Museum of Natural History. So this is what you get into once you start going into that transition between desert and grassland. You can see that it still looks like winter there. Nothing had come up yet, but you can imagine what this must look like, how vibrant and beautiful and green it must be when it starts to wake up. And in the backgrounds, you can start to see there's a whole series of mountains to the north there. There's all kinds of agaves in there and all kinds of other woody shrubs along with the grasslands. Okay, so this is what you're transitioning to. So more grasslands, but you can see there's more and more woody shrubs. Once you get to the Chiricahua Mountains, this is what it looks like. You can see there's all kinds of what turns out to be mostly pines and oaks on these very beautiful eroded Chiricahua Mountains. And as you keep on going up and up and up, you get into these quite dense oak woodland forests and pine. The other thing we thought was pretty interesting, and I'll just go back for a moment. This is Apache right here. That's not the name of the First Nation. That's actually the name of a town. And when we went to stop to take this picture, there was I guess a monument to Geronimo and Geronimo when he finally surrendered. And I put a question mark at the end of that. That was 1886, because Geronimo was a pretty interesting guy. He actually surrendered and then escaped and went off and did more things. So it was really interesting. He ended up becoming a farmer and living to, how old was he? Like in his 90s or something. So you know, wherever you go, you see these sorts of monuments, but there's another story behind them, because this is, of course, told from the general's point of view. So this is the Southwest Research Station. It's very cool. When we were there, actually, Joyce was she was showing us all around, because Joyce did a lot of work here. I think during her, all of her, master's was up here. She worked on a rare scarlet gilly, I think, for her PhD. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. There wasn't anybody there yet, but if you look online, you see they have all kinds of really interesting courses there for the public as well as for university students. And then what caught my eye here is that they had put these nice, I'm sorry for the reflection, these nice kind of little dioramas, I guess, of the different kinds of pines and oaks. So across the bottom, you can see, you probably recognize this because it looks just like our white pine, but this is a southwestern white pine. And then you have an Apache pine, a Chihuahuan pine, and a Ponderosa pine. And this is what the Apache, I couldn't believe it when I first saw it, because it looks like this pom-pom. So that's what the actual needles of an Apache pine looks like. They're not really big pines, but they're very fluffy looking. And then there's a Mexican pinyon pine, which is of course a pinyon pine, or its species name is edulis. It's the good one to eat. And this is what the Chihuahuan pine looks like. So Chihuahuan pine and pinyon pine, they're all fire adapted. And there's been lots and lots of really interesting research done in this part of the world about fire and how climate change is going to affect the fire regime, as well as all of these plants. What I found was, I'm still in the dark about these, but the oaks down there are like nothing we have here. Of course, they have these oaks that have these tiny little leaves, and you're going, that's an oak. You know, they're really diminutive leaves. And if you look closely, you can see that many of them do have little scallops on them, but many of them belong to these, what they call live oaks. They're more shrubs than trees, and they are deciduous or semi-deciduous. So, you know, you see all these leaves, and they're really thick and glossy. Many of them got spines on them. So you can see that they're really adapted to the dry summer temperatures that they get. Okay, so that's the end of the forest. Now we're desert rats. We've gone back. We're going back right across towards the coast to Barago Springs and Enza Barago. Enza means mountain sheep. So there's lots of mountain sheep here, but we didn't see them. It's a long trip. You have to go through Gila Bend. You're right on the border of Mexico. And let me tell you, there are so many border police there. It's unbelievable. In fact, they have a stop, and you have to stop. And when they heard we were from Canada, the guy waved us right through. But Dave is going to take over now and tell you about some of the interesting things we saw on the way there.
Yeah, well, I thought it was interesting to put in what, you know, Google Map tells you how to go. So it's like a 5 or 6 hour drive. I think we stopped for lunch in Yuma.
Oh my
And
God, it was
it
horrible.
was, well, it was sunny, but windy, like a headwind. The gas mileage wasn't very good with the headwind with the car we had rented. But so we have lunch in Yuma, and then we cross over the mighty Colorado River into California. And we were I guess we didn't do our research. We didn't know what to expect, but we're driving through basically sand dunes, and with the wind, this is what the driver, I think Luise was driving, had to deal with, was blowing sand. And you could see these irrigation canals. So we're in basically a desert area. And as I'll show you an aerial photo from satellite photo from Google Earth, this is where all of that produce that we pick up in our grocery store comes from. I think these are fields full of spinach. So it's interesting to look at Google Map here. So here's Yuma down here. We're crossing the Colorado River. This is the Colorado River here, which did have water in it, and crossing through this sandy dune area. And all of a sudden, you're out of the desert and you're into this agricultural area. Well, obviously, this used to be desert, and it's only there because of the irrigation, some of it from the Salton Sea, which has its own problems, but also the Colorado River. So it was quite an eye-opener for a Canadian here to drive through and see all this produce being produced. And we ended up in our destination here was Borrego Springs, and they have a very good visitor center, interpretation center. And at the time we were there, they highlighted these areas for wildlife or for wildflower viewing. So Palm Canyon, Coyote Canyon, Henderson Road, which is very easy to access, and this June Wash, which is a little bit further away, but not too far. And then we did, by chance, bump into a group of people that were stopped by the side of the road, and of course, with binoculars and spotting scopes, and it turned out that they're members of this so-called Hawk Watch. And what stimulated their project, which they've been doing for quite a few years now, is because it's one of the largest spring concentrations of migrating Swainson's hawks. So they were there to count and observe these hawks as they were kettling, flying around, getting ready to move north. That's the migration. And I stole this from their website. We did see some, but they were kind of hard to photograph. The only good photograph I got was this prairie falcon that was on the top of a tree here. But yeah, it was quite interesting talking to them and getting interpretation from the park people that took us to these wildflower areas, which I'll hand it over to Louise. So this is what the first place, you just
Yeah.
drive up and park and there you are.
Yeah, I just have to say, we met a lot of really interesting people with those hawk watchers. They were from all over. They come all over, mostly the US, and they all come down there to help count hawks. They were very interested. Many of them had been to Canada. Anyway, it was just kind of fun to meet some people that were, I mean, so dedicated. They were standing out in the rain in the morning, in the evening. Anyway, it was started by a guy who happened to turn 80 the day we were there. So he's still at it. So yes, retirement is different to different things. So what we're looking at here is basically what we saw most of. It's very sandy looking. When it gets wet, it turns into sloppy clay and you cannot get it off your shoes, I can tell you. So in the front is one of the desert verbenas. And it's ubiquitous in sandy areas. It's most beautiful. It has a gorgeous aroma, and it is a really important plant for the early arriving butterflies and moths that have the long tongues, because it's got we didn't get a close-up, but it's like most verbenas, if you've seen them, they've got a long throat, and that's where the nectar is. So it's a really pivotal, it starts to bloom early in February, and it's pivotal for a lot of the insects that are coming out of their overwintering. So just to give you some desert sand verbena, and then the other most beautiful one that I loved was the dune evening primrose. Beautiful big flowers. You can see it looks like any primrose you've ever seen with the cross stigma. But what's really interesting about this evening primrose is how important, again, it is for all the insects that are starting to come out. Of course, it opens up late at sunset, and it's incredibly fragrant, and it is pollinated mostly by hawk moths that come out in the evening. It has long threads of pollen which adhere to the hawk moths, and that's how they get pollinated. But I thought what was really interesting is that it also has a number of solitary bees, native bees, that come in the morning and pick up all the extra pollen that hasn't been dispersed by the hawk moths. So again, you see this kind of, a number of different pollinators using plants in different ways. And the other one that was out, when you look at this picture, is that, you see the purple, you see the white, and then you see the yellow, which are the desert sunflowers. And again, the desert sunflowers are really neat because they're really cued. Their seeds don't germinate until there's at least 1 inch of rain. And once you get that 1 inch of rain, all of a sudden they all come up. It's one of the earliest spring wildflowers, again, along with the verbena, and it has its own species of solitary bees that only use the sunflower. So again, there's a hypothesis that the bees are actually cued by the same environmental conditions that the sunflower is. So what I found was so neat is that all of a sudden there are all these plants, but there's all these pollinators, a huge diversity of pollinators, different species and types that are also cued to all of these plants, which in turn cued to the environment. So another place we went is Coyote Canyon. I put this in for Wilf, a beautiful lupin. There are other species of lupin, but this is the first one that comes out. And there's a desert lupin. And well, what did Wilf say? I think there's how many 100 species or something. So they're beautiful. You can see they stand out. Many of these canyons are very sandy substrate with some rocks, but this Coyote Wash is just sand. The other little flower, we had a hard time IDing this because it's one of those ones, because it's not bright and shiny. It's colorful. Nobody puts it in their guides. And this is actually an onyx flower. So it's in a Caryophyllaceae, and it forms this incredible mat. And it's actually quite fragrant, but again, nobody pays attention to it because it has these tiny glass-like white flowers. But what I forgot to mention, and is that you see it has a creamy a part here on the upper banner, and that tells you that this one has not been pollinated, because once it pollinates, you can see these lower ones here no longer have that white. It turns that rosy color, and that's because these are hard to pollinate. You got to be a big brute of a bumblebee to get in there and do it, right? So when it turns that red color, it's like a signal. It's a signal to the bumblebee, don't bother going here because it's already pollinated. Don't waste your effort. Okay, so many different species. And like I said, we just saw a small percentage. Each one of these has an incredible story. I mean, here's one, here's another evening primrose. Again, it's an annual. And it same thing, opens in the afternoon. It has a specific pollinator. Again, I think it's an andrenid that pollinates only that one. So, there's all these neat stories. There's the tuberosa, this one here, which obviously, is a hummingbird flower, lots of red flowers. In fact, it was raining the day we saw this on the Palm Canyon walk. And I'll tell you, all you do is stand there, and there were like hummingbird wars going on there, because it was just a wash, which is like a stream that's dried up, but is seasonally wet. And it's just all over there, and it's just blooming, and there's, I don't know how many different types of hummingbirds. But again, these are hugely important because that's the migrating hummingbirds from Mexico are coming up, and they use this to sustain themselves on the migration. Let's see. Okay, the broom rape is pretty cool. I read last night that broom rape is actually considered a noxious weed in California and Arizona because it will actually parasitize the roots of tomatoes. And as Dave showed you, where they are growing all of that agricultural, those crops, it's actually made the transition to cropland, which I thought was pretty neat. But again, these are don't have true roots. They have something called hystoria, which are how they glom on to other roots and steal their photosynthate from them. Most of them are in the sunflower family in the desert. Okay, pincushion, again, another gorgeous little flower, and the desert marigold. So all of these sunflower family, there are hundreds of species and many genera, and they are all so important for early flowering and for especially bees. Again, I'm not even going to get into the cacti. We are way too early for cacti, unfortunately. Some of them were just tempting us with their things. They're in full bloom now, but the diversity is amazing. Most of the flower guides don't actually even you have to buy a special one for the cacti because there are so many different species of beaver tail cactus, for example, of cholla, of, all the different mammillarias and things. So you can see just the beautiful, beautiful symmetry of and colors of all of their different hooks. Believe me, I got one of these in my head. They hurt like hell. These teddy bear cholla and the jumping cholla, which is found only in Arizona, they will drop off these little pods that you see at the bottom here, and they just start all new plants. And in many cases, the fruits actually don't have many fertile seeds in them at all because they tend to reproduce vegetatively with these little jumping bits, which will jump right into your head and stick to your feet. Let me tell you, once they get into your runners, it's almost impossible to get them out. Anyway, they're absolutely beautiful. Apparently, pack rats, the little wood rats, they have pads that those spines don't penetrate, and they actually line their nests with these things, which I can't even imagine. How cozy. Anyway, we went to June Wash, which was right down in the south, and that's where one agave had put up its flowering site and had opened one flower just for us. So you see this beautiful, looks like a giant asparagus, of course, in the same family. It has these beautiful rosettes. First Nations used to take off the tips and then bury them in pits and then have roast. They're apparently really good. They have these huge, you can see the potential. This is just one small side shoot, which you can't see here. It was on the other side. But they have these huge, almost, they look like huge candelabras of hundreds and hundreds of these beautiful yellow flowers. And you can see how much pollen they must produce. You know, they're pollinated by all different kinds of species too. Anyway, again, you can see it's very sandy. Wash is where when it's really raining, this is where the water will come out. And four-wheel driving in the desert there is a huge thing. And so people can take their four-wheel drives and go way, way, way back up in here, but we just walked. And I think I'm getting near the end here. One of the most beautiful ones was the desert lily. It has this incredible fragrance.
And we only found it because one of the hawk women
Yeah.
told us where it was.
One of the hawk watchers says, oh, you want to see one? I'll tell you exactly where they are. And sure enough, that's where it was. So they are absolutely, I think, one of my favorites. They are very ethereal looking. I think one of the coolest thing is, and here's a little juvenile. So we started looking for little juveniles, we found a bunch of them around this big mother plant. They have these really unique strap-shaped wavy leaves, and you can't mistake it for anything else, which is kind of cool because it's like, oh, that's what it is. You don't have to worry about misidentifying it. But again, it has, it's pollinated by hawk moths. And it has its incredibly beautiful fragrance, as I said. But they're very specific in where they grow. You can see that it's very sandy. Again, another one called the Spanish needles, which is beautiful, and a little mustard, which you can't mistake them. Okay, you're taking over now, aren't you?
Well, yeah, so one of our last long trips was to visit Joyce's daughter lives in Flagstaff. And so the week before we had booked, was it 3 nights we booked?
4 nights, I think.
4 nights at a B&B. And then the weather started to turn. So we were kind of trying to decide, okay, well, should we cancel or not? And it turns out we weren't able to cancel the B&B. So we decided, well, we better just go. And given the weather, the day driving up the day was not a problem. It was only going to be 1 day of bad snow. So we thought, well, we know how to deal with snow. We lived in Newfoundland. So
Yeah.
we went ahead and did that. And on the way up, we stopped at Sedona. And that's where that one picture is. There was a few flowers blooming there, this purple matte pink.
Carry on.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so here's on the top left there is me shoveling snow.
So believe me, he got his snow shoveling in.
And then, of course, once we were able to, which had one down day, I guess, the next day after this, we were able to drive to the Grand Canyon, since the roads were fairly clear. And of course, we took gazillions of pictures of the Grand Canyon only from the south rim. It was kind of nice to have that accent of white on the edge there, sort of a different view than you normally get of the Grand
Yeah,
Canyon.
I was going to say Joyce she worked in the Grand Canyon down at you can see this is where you climb down the rim, kind of right next to here. You climb all the way down, and then this is one of the routes, and then you go down into the canyon this way. And she's been down there many, many, many times, and she said that's the first time she's ever seen so much snow. So it was definitely a different type of a visit to Grand Canyon. And of course, then they have the beautiful pines.
Okay, yeah.
Wow.
Now, this is the Desert Museum, which is on the outskirts of Tucson. You know, it's a combination of some indoor viewing places, but mostly outdoor. Very well done, very well,
It's really awesome.
quite diverse in terms of flora and fauna. And I took this picture of a cactus wren. And there were some flowering cactuses there as well, cacti. And then they have these javelina, you know, the
No,
wild
wild pigs,
pigs that I guess are chomping on this cactus here.
the beaver tail.
And they
the
had
oak
a kind of a partial zoo too. They had a coyote.
Yeah, they
there.
had coyotes, they had all kinds of different things. Anyway, it's worth going because they have kind of recreated all different types, vegetation types, and they have this specialty cacti garden. And that's when I really realized how into cacti they are, because here are these people, you think, oh, you know, there's one guy was obviously a motorcycle guy, and they're all fawning over these flowering cacti. It was really interesting. There was this one old couple, and they were just arguing about this species of cacti because they thought they'd got it wrong. It was, you know, it was really interesting just to see people and how interested they were. They get a huge number of visitors every year. And like I said, if you have a chance to visit, it's just fantastic. Okay, and I think that's it.
Yeah.
That's all we have to say.
Well, pretty wonderful. I've got to say. I can't believe the snow. That was certainly a surprise. Was it a surprise for you?
No, we knew it was going to be a bad one.
You did.
But luckily, I'll say this, luckily, the B&B we were staying at, or the Airbnb, only had one shovel.
Oh,
And guess who got to use that?
I guess Dave was one who knew how to use it.
That's
Yeah.
right, he did.
I have a permit to do it.
Yeah, it's a permit, but it was nice and fluffy snow, I can say that.
Good. I would welcome people to turn on their videos again and also unmute themselves if they would like to make comments or ask questions.
Louise, you mentioned about climate change and maybe causing effects in that area, but is there a sort of a trend that's obvious? Because as we've seen this past year, the place can get clobbered with snow and rain and every kind of awful stuff that's unusual.
So, I mean,
does it sort of? Go ahead.
I guess there's several trends which are kind of, how shall we say, it's kind of ubiquitous, especially in North America. Well, in Western North America, it's getting hotter and drier for longer, and the plants are drying out, so there's higher probability of forest fire, and then of course the intensity of forest fire is much higher. I mean, you're even seeing that in Newfoundland too. The whole thing about how precipitation comes, so you know that especially California and to a lesser degree Arizona had that long drought. And then, so droughts are going to be more intense and longer, but then of course you have these freak rainstorms that come and dump huge amounts. But even on the island of Newfoundland, it's the same thing, right? It's getting drier. People are complaining to me they have to water their lawn or garden or whatever. Whereas before, I remember you never had to water your garden because it rained every day or every second day in the summer. Now it doesn't do that anymore. It's the same in the West Coast, right? So the idea is that there's going to be, you know, the amount of rain may not change that much or may get a little wetter, but it's the periodicity. So it's going to be more intense rainstorms less often, right? So that's pretty much the same as it is like where we are now, where we had a very, very dry March, we had a dry fall, and then all of a sudden we got this huge deluge because there was another one of the Pineapple Expresses, you know, the what do they call them? Atmospheric rivers, right? So it's becoming more unpredictable, but I think it's really like around the research station where they've been doing a lot of work, especially around wildfire, because many of those species, those pines and those oaks are fire adapted, right? So they've got thick barks, they've got, cones that only open after they've been burnt, like, all the sorts of things that you expect. But the problem is now they're getting drier because there's less rain overall, and then they're getting hotter during the heat season. They're getting more lightning, and so they're getting more fire. And like I said, that fire is much more intense. So the problem is these oaks and pines are not able to regenerate because the adults get killed, and then there's no more substrate, because a substrate is being consumed because they're so intense, so hot. Yeah. Sorry, long-winded answer.
Yeah, but just one additional bit on that. It's like you're talking about the scrub and the pines and all that stuff. But in the real deserty desert, with little scrappy little spiny things growing, are these gonna like end up just sand dunes, or are some of these things probably sort of, I don't know, climate change proof or something?
So definitely some of the because you're in, especially the Sonoran Desert and the Chihuahuan Desert, which go way further south, right? So they're kind of drought proof in that it gets much hotter, in their center of origin in the Mexico for those two deserts. So I think in many of those, because they can store water, I think what they're worried about too is things like creosote and things like that do burn, and they do have fires, but in the rocky desert where you have mostly like bulbs and cacti, but there are still a lot of herbaceous species that come up based on the rain, right? So in many of those cases, they can stay ungerminated for, 20 years, right? So, I think it's not as clear cut for some of those, like what I would call desert species, like true desert species, compared to the ones where there's more vegetation.
Yeah. So, like, how dry can you get, I mean, it's.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think they know, but I know a lot of stuff died, in the Californian drought, but a lot of that was more in treed areas rather than the desert areas.
Yeah.
And I mentioned in one of your last slides, one of the later ones, you said there was a pine tree, and it looked like somebody had taken the trunk and the branches and twisted them like you would wring out a face cloth.
Yeah, you're very observant. I found the bark really intriguing because I'm trying to remember what's that alligator? Is it called the alligator oak? You look at this oak and it looks like as it grows to big, it actually starts to crack and fragment, and it gets a really, really thick bark. And I think that's what you're referring to, is a lot of that one that I showed actually had been through a fire, if I remember correctly. That was one they had harvested. I'm trying to remember, it wasn't the pinyon, it was a Chihuahuan pine, maybe. It had been through a fire because it's
Grand Canyon.
No, I meant, it's the one on Grand Canyon.
That's
Oh,
twisted.
sorry, I'm thinking of the wrong one. The Grand Canyon, right. So that's one of those ones that it's very, very old. And as they grow, they do have, I'm trying to remember what it's called. I bet Michael remembers, or John.
Like
when
a
you
twist.
have that, it is a twist. So when they grow, they actually get that twist as they grow. And right now I can't remember what it's called, but yeah, it's something that's not unusual in those old trees. And you got to remember, it's super windy up there and it gets very dry. So a lot of that is the outside of the bark has actually cracked off. And anyway,
There's
yeah.
no bark there. I don't
yeah.
know.
Especially
still
the branch. The branch was really twisted.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? A lot of
Mhm.
that is just, I think, the wind driven. I don't know. Anybody else have I can't remember. I know there's a term for it. I just can't remember it right now.
This
Yeah.
is Lois.
Irving?
It's almost identical to the pines that are the twisted trunks that have died in the Blomidons.
Yep.
I mean
And it's the
that
same-
that picture of that tree could have been taken just down the road from me, almost.
The pines. And then there's the bristlecone pines, right? And they're really contorted, right? As they age and their bark sloughs off, and there's only a little bit of the cambium left, which is still feeding those upper branches. So they're still alive. But yeah, they're pretty, all that bark gets eroded, whether it's in the Boma Downs or on the top of a mountain here or wherever. So yeah, it's pretty interesting how they all kind of look similar.
I like all the sunflowers. I'm a big sunflower fan. I have my kitchen done with sunflowers.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's
I
incredible.
thought they were
There are how
lovely.
many different types. There's just so many different types, and we had a heck of a time trying to figure out who was who, because it has to do with the leaves most of the time. So yeah. Actually, secretly, I'm glad a lot of things weren't out, because I think I would be in trouble trying to identify them. Yeah.
This is Marilyn. On another
Okay.
topic there, Dave referred to the sandhill cranes. I used to live in Ross River and Faro in the Yukon. And at the beginning of May month in Faro, when the cranes would fly over, and again in Ross River, we would have the Sheep and Crane Festival. And
Oh, neat.
Wow.
it was quite a big thing. And the cranes never let us down. They arrived every year right on time. And at that time of the year, it's quite hot in the Yukon. So we slept with windows open, and many times during the night, we would be
They're
awakened with the
noisy.
cranes.
They are noisy. Well, they had an interesting phenomenon here the other day on the radio. Was it in Qualicum? I can't
I
remember.
mean, the
A
snow geese.
whole bunch of snow geese
I think
just
it's near Vancouver.
just landed, a whole flock of snow geese, because I guess they got tired and they needed a rest. So they all came down and people were kind of freaking out. But I was going to say, I was at Wood Buffalo Park many years ago, and that's where I first saw my first sandhill cranes, because they actually nest in Wood Buffalo, and that's one of the reasons it was set aside, because it's they nest right along the river there. Absolutely amazing birds.
Yeah, that's right. And they're huge. Their wingspan is approximately a meter for each wing. If anyone
yeah.
is in the Yukon anytime, there's an interpretation center in Faro, Faro, and they have a taxidermy there of a sandhill crane and the Fannin sheep as well. Plus other animals.
They're well worth going. So going to see, because,
Yeah.
but it is.
They landed in Richmond.
Well, they landed in Richmond, these snow geese.
Mm.
It's pretty funny. Anyway, it was a real, there were so many people there from all over the place. I mean, we turned off, like when we turned off to take a picture of those grasslands and the Geronimo plaque was there. There was a
Camper from Calgary.
they were from Calgary, and they just sold their house and they started traveling around, and they said, it's too cold, we're heading to Texas. So, you really meet a lot of people when you go to these
A lot of
places.
Canadians.
A lot of Canadians.
Louise, your pictures were beautiful. Dave and Louise, both of pictures
Dave.
were lovely. The Bisbee one of the grasslands and the Henderson Canyon. It's just stunning pictures. The only question I have to ask you is, did you pass the Colorado River? Did you
Yep.
pass on?
I
And
drove
when
by.
did you see what, like, because when you see it on the news, and I know it's a big, serious issue, you see the big drop in the water levels. Did you see the signs of how diminished the water level is?
You couldn't really tell, because a lot of it is channelized down where it goes
Yeah.
under the river.
Under the,
Right.
The
I mean,
bridge.
I'm sorry, under the bridge,
Under the
under
bridge.
the highway.
there's water in it.
Yeah, they're definitely water, because I mean, they keep the water there and then they channelize it and they run it right along in these big canals, right? And that's one of the problems, is that it's not covered. So the amount of evaporation from
Evaporation.
these things are amazing, apparently. So
Yeah.
there's all kinds of schemes about coming up with putting like covers over them and
Solar panels.
so, well, somebody said, why don't you put solar panels on top of them? Because that would be smart. Anyway, yeah, I was pretty shocked when you start, all of a sudden you're in the middle of a desert and there's sand dunes everywhere. And then all of a sudden you get, like Dave showed that picture of this, and it was spinach, you could tell. It was just fields and fields and fields of spinach.
Yeah, all
It was
kinds of other-
incredible.
yeah.
And there were strawberries but I mean, it would be a desert, and that's, Arizona. I heard an interesting CBC documentary on the Colorado, and they were saying Arizona was the last one to sign the treaty, so they're the ones that get kicked out first. So they were talking to some farmers that said, I think it was around Tucson too, that he basically has to give up a bunch of his different fields because he's no longer given the water he needs to farm. So he has to leave them fallow. And of course,
Well, something like 70% of the water from the Colorado goes to farming.
yeah,
And
it's
then I
amazing.
think while we were there was a news item somewhere outside of Tucson where a guy was delivering water to households,
Oh, right.
people who live outside the city that depend on either wells or rainwater capture. Sometimes they have to order water. So this guy was delivering water to households, but turns out that he could no longer do that.
Right,
And
because he couldn't
so-
get the water anymore.
So it's
people
it's
are
an
there.
interesting issue to follow, obviously. and
Yeah, it's a
ironically-
serious one.
Well, ironically, when Joyce lived in San Diego, we went to visit her there before COVID. And we took a trip up to the Sierras, up to a place called Mono Lake. And there was a sign up there about the connection between that area and the water that would be delivered to Los Angeles.
Yeah.
So if you were interested in the history of that, this guy Mulholland, who you may remember in Los Angeles, there's a place called Mulholland Drive.
Drive, yeah.
This engineer, somewhat of an engineer, was the one that basically organized the water dams and canals and things that fed Los Angeles, because without water, Los Angeles would be nothing.
Would not be there. Right? So anyway.
Quite
yes.
interesting to follow that
Yeah,
story.
so water is a huge thing. Like Tucson is growing like crazy. Phoenix, the whole, Arizona is a pretty small state. I think it doesn't have that many people. Maybe I wrote it down, 2.5 million or something. Phoenix being the biggest one, but there's all kinds of very wealthy people around that area. And I read a report the other day that said most of the water being used in that area is for swimming pools and golf. And so, it's kind of like, they're going to have to make some decisions, and they're not going to be easy decisions.
No.
So I don't know, because they're all growing like crazy because people want to live where it's nice and warm.
Yeah.
Don't
Thank
take
you.
water for granted.
Anyway, yeah.
Thanks.
packed up.
I have a friend in Arizona, and she was saying that this winter there was a bit more rain. And while they're really appreciating the flush of blooms that they're getting right now, they're worried about all the growth that's coming from it, because when it gets into the dry season, then that's more material that can burn, right? And so
Yeah.
it's kind of that double-edged sword, where really happy to see the benefits of all the rain, but it comes with a price, right? So it's going to be
Well,
interesting.
but
to see
I
how
would
that
suggest
goes through.
maybe that cycle was there before the humans.
Well, that's true. Yes, exactly.
And it-
Yeah,
and it-
there's
And
yeah.
it comes back to poor land use planning, right? Why are they letting, and this is the same, not just in Arizona, it's the same here. It's the same on like all the up and down. People are building in areas that they shouldn't be building because they have high fire risk associated with them, right? And
Yeah,
so now, it's kind of like now they're trying to walk it back, the land planners, and it's not so easy once it's out there, but
Yeah, it's like
once you
towns built in
community-
floodplains,
well, it's exactly the same thing,
Yeah,
right? So
yeah.
yeah, I don't, like I said, it's gonna take some interesting discussion, see how that's all gonna change in terms of, but what I found neat about Tucson is that it actually gets summer monsoons, which I don't know why I didn't know that, but I didn't know that. And so it gets summer monsoon. So I'm going, well, why aren't people doing rainwater capture, right? I mean, that's what we do here. All of our rain, like last year here, we had no rain, not a drop for 4 months. 4
Wow.
months, no rain. So it was a pretty dry year. And then we had a dry fall, and we're still not up to what we were. But, the thing is, you can have rainwater capture because when it rains, right? So, I mean, there are ways of getting around, sopping off all the Colorado River or whatever, the Salton Sea, if they had better planning in terms of things like rainwater capture and whatever. Anyway.
Great photos too that was mentioned there. I love that cactus and all this the variety within that family. It's just amazing. And as you probably experienced there, it's not the ones with the bigger needles that are the problems. It's those tiny little needles that you think you haven't touched them, and then all of a sudden you go to pick something up and it pushes into your skin, and they're just so difficult to find and to get out. So but just beautiful.
Beaver tails, right? Yeah, the beaver tails.
Exactly.
Right? You think they're nice and waxy. You don't see the big spines. You think they're great, but they've got these little, they're called Glaucidia, and they're brutal. Yeah. Anyway, I'll tell you, that one that stuck in my head, that chihuahua, man, did that hurt getting it out. Dave had a not so nice picture of me trying to get it out. I said, you better not put that in.
Yeah, great.
Well, this is Paul and Diane from New Hampshire. We really love Newfoundland. We've spent quite a bit of time on the West Coast, and we love this talk. We've spent quite a bit of time in the Nogales area, Patagonia Lake State Park.
Wow.
Chiricahua Mountains. We have a small travel trailer, so we spend considerable time there. We do have 2 pair of snow geese that are not snow geese, but the sandhill cranes that are now nesting in New Hampshire, which is quite interesting. But we love the talk and getting back to the desert. And hello, Michael and John, and Anne has disappeared, but we love Newfoundland and all the people we've met up there.
Yeah. Well, we miss it too, but we keep going back. Anyway. Well. No more good.
Okay.
Yeah, well, no
Thanks.
more. Thank
Thanks
you
for
for listening.
No, we want to say
Sorry we
thank
didn't have
you,
more
Luise and Dave. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
We really, really enjoyed it. I know everyone did. And I'm quite keen to look at some of those websites, especially the one with the desert flowers.
Oh, yeah.
Because
It's just incredible.
that would be fun to see.
They have a lot of great background information and just the pictures there. There's also lots of art interspersed around, which we didn't even actually talk about, but yeah, it's a really amazing place. They've done an amazing job. Yeah.
Those boots wouldn't do much in the garden, though. They're kind of cool, but they're not very good gardening boots.
No.
One thing that seems to be interesting to me is that when these super blooms do in fact get going to amazing extents, you can see them from outer space. The color of the countryside it just changes from the blossoms, and it's visible from the space station and all this.
Joyce was actually over towards the Mojave, our friend Joyce Mashinsky, and she sent some pictures of the California poppy bloom, and it's the same thing. You look up over the hills way far, it's just orange. It's amazing. Yeah. Anyway, we missed it, but anyway.
Next time.
Yeah, but you got a reason to go back now.
And you got a lot. We appreciate your sharing what you got, because it's so much for us who didn't get anything. Coming here in April, we don't have anything, not yet. So
We keep looking and hoping.
Well, it'll happen just like that.
yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Okay.
Yeah, it was really nice to see everybody. Thanks
Bye.
for coming.
Thank you.
Great talk.
Thank
You
you.
guys, take care. Bye.
Thanks, Karen.
Bye.
Yeah. Take care.
Next time.
See you guys.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.